Welcome back. Now, the collaboration between government and the private sector is crucial in stimulating economic growth. And as we navigate through the realms of crisis management as well as sustainable development, it prompts the question on the progress of this alliance. How do we ensure that government and the private sector are in consistent partnership for the economic growth that we're seeking? And joining us to think this through is CEO at Business Leadership South Africa, Busi Mavuso, who'll join us later, but also founding director at the Center for African Management and Markets, and also an economics lecturer at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, Adrian Saville. Prof, a pleasure. Good afternoon.
Great. Thank you for being with you.
Adrian, maybe we can start off by maybe reflecting on this new kind of, I'll call it a dynamic between the private sector and the government. It's on the back of crisis, so, it has its own kind of characteristics, but it is rather a new way in which we're seeing the partnership emerge.
I suppose it is a new way in South African conversation or discussion, certainly in recent times, but perhaps it's worth taking a step back and, just reflecting on a much longer history in South Africa and equally a longer history globally. Because I would venture that the throwaway statement on this is there is no country that has achieved prosperity where the public and private sector are at odds with each other. There might be tensions, there might be disagreements, but it's very, very difficult to build a cohesive society where these two vital organs are not in collaboration. And we find these examples from around the world and through time. And, my reference to South Africa is just to remind us that South Africa was able to overcome a very, very dark part of its history under apartheid structure by having a private sector that worked with parties, not the public sector in the way that we've got it shaped in this conversation. But I think that it also equips us to be reminded, of the potential of things that can be catalyzed or transpire out of these types of partnerships. When they work well, they are exceptionally powerful.
So I must ask you, Prof, on the back of that, and maybe what we see today with the relationship between South Africa's government and the private sector, one that has in the past been marred by a little bit of suspicion and, the pulling in different directions. But I think we all agree now that we're supposed to move in a certain direction. We're all hopelessly aiming for a better economic growth here. I'm wondering if on the back of the crisis that we see today, whether it's at Eskom, at Transnet, with crime and corruption, we can begin to have a more constructive relationship, one that isn't so characterized by weird suspicions and even, I would say, a mismatch in terms of ideologies.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things just to drop into the discussion in response to that observation. The first is, I think that the reasons for the suspicion or the cynicism are well-founded. And it's easy for each side to blame the other. No side is faultless here. Government has made mistakes and misstepped. So has the private sector. Whilst understanding the origins, of those dysfunctions is helpful, it doesn't equip us to stay immersed in them and stuck in that conversation of who we're going to blame for where we are. This is the position we're in. How do we fix from here? And I think there is a recognition, as you point out, on the part of both the public and the private sector that if ever there was a time for collaboration, it is now. That the public sector cannot do this without the help and support of the private sector, and we can make the exact same sentence the other way around with private and public. And I think, putting a private sector hat on, because that, of course, is where I'm far more equipped or comfortable speaking, but, thinking about, how the private sector perhaps really equips itself is in at least two ways. The first is to build a cohesive and a coherent voice, that there is a risk of, peddling agendas, that what's in it for me. And the single most important outcome of any agenda is that South Africa, as an economy, as a country, as a society, is transitioned and transformed. We are sorely lacking in that regard. And the second is for the private sector to be, let me try and find the right word, to be constructive and engaged, as opposed to reactive and blaming. And I overuse relationship analogies, but I think it helps us think, all the way down at the level of the individual. If you're trying to solve something between partners, between a couple, you're unlikely to solve it by trying to figure out who's to blame and how the other person needs to change. It's what do I bring to the party? Here's what I can offer, and here are the things that I'm able to put into the cocktail to help fix.
I'm also keen, to get your thoughts, Prof. And this is something that I think the development scholars and I think economists have been trying to figure out for a very, very long time here. The real role of the private sector in matters of development. In Finance 101, you'll hear that, the private sector or business that exists specifically for shareholder value. It's the first thing you taught in your first Finance 1 lecture. But of course, we know that the world is slightly more nuanced than that. With the crises that we've seen from the pandemic to where we are now with geopolitical tensions, it is just slightly more complex. So when we speak about the emerging role of private sector in areas of development here in South Africa and maybe the world at large, are we still heavily debating the fact that this relationship is transforming?
Well, I've already made the point that I think that there is a yawning deficit here in terms of what we set out to do and what we have achieved as a society. So let's not get stuck in who's to blame for that. That's for another place, another time. If we just take some of the headline numbers, inequality represented by the Gini coefficient, we have some of the highest income inequality in the world with a Gini coefficient of 0.65. That's slightly higher than 1994 when the ANC came to power. Our unemployment number sits stubbornly stuck at 30%. Youth unemployment sits at 60%. Economic growth has been missing in action for the better part of a decade. Both the private and the public sectors have had their hands stuck in their pockets when it comes to investing. And I don't mean that they're putting their hands in their pockets to find funds. They're putting their hands in their pockets not to invest. So from a range of perspectives, we are in a troubled place. And here, my observation on your comment about the economic growth and economic development, I think it's worth underlining two things in the work that we do on helping businesses think about their competitive strategy and position. The first is that one of the single most powerful drivers of company performance is country economic growth. If your country isn't growing quickly, your business is going to have a tougher time, all else equal. And I'll remind you of the earlier stat that I gave, which is that South Africa has been stuck in effectively 0% economic growth for the better part of a decade. Our per capita incomes are the same today as the time of the Football World Cup in 2010. And that is going to make a tough time even for, the most compelling and competitive business model. So that's one point, is to recognize that it's in everyone's interest, public sector, private sector, business, communities, to build growth structures. The second is that when we look at the performance of companies that are able to really pull away from economic gravity, there is an overarching attribute of these businesses that they have models where the company and community are recognized as being inextricably intertwined, that it is very difficult to build a business that sustains across years, decades, generations, in an environment in which that company is extracting from the community as opposed to building the community. So if there was one thing that businesses could do in this environment, regardless of what the public sector does, is it would be to think very hard about the business models that they're building. And there's some fantastic examples here. I happen to have the great privilege of spending part of Monday with James Mwangi, the founding CEO of Equity Bank in Kenya, and the models that they have built under a banking license are absolutely remarkable, and powerful lessons that we could take away from those types of initiatives and endeavors.
Prof, actually, you mentioned also the issue of investment and hands in pockets, and I think it's a very interesting analogy, because what it does also maybe create here is the question around investment and whether at this point is it the chicken or the egg, which one is coming first, Prof? Prof, at this, it does kind of put us in that position. I'm keen to get your thoughts on this one.
So that I love the chicken or egg, who's going to go first? You're absolutely, on the money in terms of that provocation. Who goes first? So, 2 points to make around this that I think are useful in our discussion, or I hope are useful in our discussion. The first is that in every country that has transitioned and transformed, every single one of them has an elevated investment rate. That number sits at 25% of GDP and higher. Now, South Africa's number for the last 5 years or so has sat closer to 15% of GDP. So we are a long way off the required investment rate. You can say all you like about our intended growth or our growth ambition until we square up to that investment deficit. The growth simply cannot materialize. It's a fiction. It's a fantasy. We're living in the world of unicorns and rainbows. So we have to get that investment number up. And then what I love in your question is, who goes first? Is it the public sector or is it the private sector? And there's really powerful work from around the world, across countries, over decades. This research indicates that the catalyst for private sector investment is public sector investment, and that the public sector should actually go first. I don't mean this the way I say it, but you could think of the private sector as being sort of a little bit cowardly or reticent or hesitant. You go first, then we'll follow. And some years back, probably 7 or 8 years back, I looked after a piece of research with Robert Matsila. He was at the IDC at the time, and he asked the exact same question about the catalyst for private sector investment in South Africa. And when we started the research, we had a whole lot of hypotheses. We wondered if it was interest rates, if it was investor confidence, if it was currency volatility. What was it that really propelled or provoked the private sector into investing? And to our delight, to our surprise, what we found was that in the case of South Africa, it was exactly the global evidence that is resident in South Africa, that the driver of private sector investment is public sector investment. And the experiences of the noughties decade, when we had all of the investment in highways and airports, the new building of power stations, although not everything landed up the way that we wanted, that was the last time that South Africa experienced elevated investment. And it's worth remembering that 2004, 5, 6, 7 experienced economic growth of 4, 5, and 6% per annum. It was investment-led growth.
I must ask you, Prof, and an important, I think, perspective to have at this point is this election that hangs over our heads. It does pose, I guess, a new challenge and the kind of election or political risk that we don't often have to contend with as a society, but it's here, and we do have to contend with it. And I'm wondering what that also does for our investment story, maybe today, but even more than today, Prof, what it does for us, maybe in December, that's maybe in the fourth quarter of this year, with this, elevated risk, but also this environment that does seem to threaten even the efforts that we've made and the strides that the private sector and the public sector have put together in collaboration?
Sure. Now you take me off script.
Yes, sorry, Prof.
Let's have a go.
Yeah.
And I'll share my thoughts here without any political agenda. Just to caveat that. I think if the ANC had delivered on their previous manifesto, this would be a slam dunk of an election. We could be relatively assured that the ANC would achieve a comfortable majority. Unfortunately, the ANC has got itself into a position where the distance between its promises and its delivery gets wider and wider. And I'll just take a headline number of economic growth as being a good illustrator of that. And please, I don't want this to be interpreted as I'm bashing the ANC or I'm not recognizing the things that the ANC has achieved. There have been extraordinary successes, but we have fallen short in terms of economic transition and economic inclusion. So, what does that mean? It means we go into May with high levels of uncertainty, speculation that we could see a coalition government. That is a squandered opportunity for a party that, at one point had an overwhelming majority. If we go all the way back to the early 1990s, they could have taken tough decisions. And where you have a fragile majority or perhaps a coalition, it's much harder to take tough economic decisions with a fragile majority or coalition government. So, I worry about what this might mean for feeding investor confidence. What it doesn't change is, regardless of what happens on the other side of May 29, we have to get into the business of building the investment base of this country. Otherwise, in 5 years' time, I fear that the conversation we will be having will be about an even more feeble economy, where you've got 1.5% economic growth, an ongoing investment drought, then entrenched unemployment and just stubborn inequality. So to my mind, the call to action and the mandate for the party in power is pretty clear. Get on with the investment agenda to build this country's infrastructural and institutional base.
And Prof, with that said, I think before I let you go, I must ask you about private-public partnerships. They're meant to be, this wonderful solution. I think it talks to risk sharing and resource sharing and reward sharing here. Are we making use of this tool as effectively as possible?
It's early days. You've got on both sides of the table, perhaps that's the poor analogy, but you've got on both sides of the table, you've got willing partners. It's critical that they find each other. I think that there is a shared ambition, there is a shared vision. That's a great place to start any relationship. Your question specifically, are we doing enough with this? No, not yet. We have made important strides, and I think at least one place where we've seen very valuable gains is in renewable energy. There are bold strides being made in baseload energy, and I think the next iteration, and it's an absolute imperative, is in transport infrastructure. So we have to move together, and we have to move quickly on these. And I would say that those are necessary conditions, together and quickly, which is exactly the essence or the heart of a PPP.
Well, Prof, that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure engaging with you. Unfortunately, Busi Mavuso could not make this conversation. We'll speak to her at another occasion. But in the meantime, that was a CAM founding director, Professor Adrian Saville.